I think stories tell things better than anything else. And this morning I have basically a long story for you. It's a true story from the book Miracles and Other Wonders. It's a story by Charles Sellier. This one begins with the Anders family who lost their mother, and Will, the father, decided to move from LA back to his hometown in Wyoming to give what he thought was a better life to his two children, Cassie, age 13, and Abel, age 7. It was morning, and Cassie had prepared breakfast. It was on the table. She had prepared their lunches. It was ready for them to pick up and take with them. And as she was calling everyone to breakfast, the radio was on, and the radio said that there was a warning, a big weather warning, that a Siberian Express was coming through. Well, Will knew what that meant. He had lived in Wyoming as a child, and he knew that a Siberian Express could be a very dangerous thing. And so he said to his children that morning, "Be sure to take your heavy coats today." The weather had been beautiful, and they'd been wearing their light jackets. He said, "This is nothing to be, to take lightly. Wear your heavy coats." But Cassie was thinking, she would have to carry that heavy coat around with her all day. So she decided she was going to just take her light jacket. And she knew that she was not going to be able to take the school bus home because she had promised one of the neighbors that she would pick up some medication for her that day. And so she felt like it was only a 1.5 mile walk, and that by the time, she'd get home before anything happened. But around 4:30, the storm came with a vengeance. And Cassie was taking her shortcut through the pasture when the storm struck. And she buttoned her jacket and she put her head down as the wind howled and the cold blew right through. A storm like this could drop the temperature 50 degrees in a matter of moments. And she started to run. With her head down, she didn't happen to see the gopher hole until she heard her leg go in and snap. At that moment, she realized that she was totally and completely alone and helpless and not close enough to either house to be heard over the scream of the wind. Will, back at the office, decided to call it a day and go home. He had a nagging feeling of foreboding and that he'd had all day long. He just felt something was wrong. And it was nearly an hour since she had fallen. And it was already below freezing. She had tried to drag herself toward the house, but the intense pain and cold soon sapped what little strength that she had. She knew the gravity of her situation. She knew that if she didn't get help soon, she would die. It wasn't the fear of death that brought the greatest sorrow, though, to her heart. It was the thought of what her death would do to her father and brothers so soon after the passing of their mother. Will made a dash for his car and placed some invoices on the briefcase to check later and drove for home. At a turn, he put his hand over on the briefcase to hold the papers in place so that they wouldn't slide off. But when he felt, there were no papers there. He stopped the car. He looked on the floor. He looked beside the seats. No papers. He thought he must have put them down at the last minute in the office, so he turned around and drove back to the office. Now, for nearly 2 hours, Cassie had been lying in the open field. There was nothing she could do but roll herself up into a tight little ball and try to protect herself from the rampaging wind and cold. Little Cassie Anders was about to give up and drift off when she heard a voice calling her name. It was a soft, gentle voice, like her mother's, and it came sharply to her ears in spite of the roar of the wind. Cassie opened her eyes, searching the darkness. She could make out a form. It was a woman, much older than her mother, but full of kindness. The woman carried a heavy winter coat and quickly knelt next to Cassie, slipping the coat around her shivering shoulders and tucked it in tight under her chin. "Who are you? How did you find me?" The coat, the warmth of the woman's embrace, had given Cassie new hope. "I heard you crying, dear," the woman said, "and I came because I'm not going to let a freezing cold night carry you off." Cassie turned inside the coat and tried to get her injured leg covered to take advantage of the warmth. When she did, a button came loose in her hand. Will was back at the office looking for the papers, and the phone rang. And he thought, "I don't even think I'll answer that. I'm not going to fix anybody's computer problems tonight." But for some reason, he picked up the phone, probably compulsive like me. And at this time, on the other end, there was a soft voice that said, "This is Lillian Morgan. Mr. Anders, you must hurry if you are going to save your dear little Cassie. She has fallen in the back pasture and broken her leg. She is in danger of freezing to death. Mr. Anders, you must hurry." Will remembered the shortcut Cassie had pointed out to him through the pasture. "Please, Cassie," he thought, "please, please, hang on." Cassie turned to look into the woman's face. "Are you sure my daddy is coming?" she asked. "Oh, yes, he surely is." She put both arms around Cassie's shoulders and whispered, "You can close your eyes now, darling. I'll watch over you till your daddy comes." Suddenly, Will's headlights illumined the pasture. He thought someone was definitely there. "Cassie!" he screamed against the wind and raced toward the figure he could see only dimly. "Cassie, is that you?" "Don't worry, little one," the woman said. "Your daddy has found you." In the next instant, Will was standing over the huddled and broken body of his little daughter. "Oh, Cassie," he sobbed and lifted her into his arms. The heavy wool coat that had been tucked around her was gone, and Will quickly wrapped her in his own heavy coat. "Oh, Daddy, you found me," Cassie said, "just like the lady said you would." "What lady, sweetheart?" he said, laying her down in the back seat. "She was just here, Daddy, and she told me you were coming." Will had another surprise in store. As he opened the door and slid under the steering wheel, the dome light came on. There, stacked neatly on the top of his briefcase, were the invoices he had gone back to the office to find. Will slammed the car into reverse to take her straight to the little clinic, emergency room, and doctor in their small town. Driving through the storm, he glanced down at the invoices. What if I hadn't gone back for them, he thought. What if I hadn't been there to take that phone call? Cassie told them about the lady and the old coat. But the doctor and Will, if the truth be known, just chalked it up to delirium. Of course, Will had thought he had seen someone in the headlights kneeling next to Cassie, but no one was there, and no coat. But then, what about that phone call? A few days later, after she'd been checked out, Cassie was home and told the story again about how the woman wrapped her in the coat and told her that her own little girl had died in a storm like that. And this time she handed Will the curious old-fashioned button from the coat. "We have to find her." And Will promised they would. They finally tracked Lillian Morgan down in a town about an hour away. They went there and rang the doorbell, and a woman in her mid-60s answered. "Miss Lillian Morgan?" Will asked hopefully. "No," the woman replied. "That's my sister. Might I ask why you want to see her?" Will retold the story carefully with a special emphasis on the phone call and the woman identifying herself as Lillian Morgan. The woman said, "I believe you, Mr. Anders, but I'm afraid it couldn't be my sister. It must have been another Lillian Morgan." "You are sure?" Cassie was crestfallen. "Are you absolutely positive?" Mrs. Holt looked into the sad, hopeful eyes of the young girl with a cast on her leg and motioned for them to follow her in. "But please be quiet," she said. Mrs. Holt led Will and Cassie. Carefully, she opened the door and peered inside and then invited them to come in. There, in a wheelchair next to the window, sat Lillian Morgan. She didn't seem even to notice that they came into the room, but Cassie's eyes brightened as soon as she saw her, and she turned excitedly to her father. "That's her, Daddy. She talked to me and kept me warm." Mrs. Holt looked at Will and shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's quite impossible. My sister's been paralyzed by a stroke for the last 6 years. She can't even speak." "When I found her," Will said, offering Mrs. Holt the button. Cassie had this clasped in her hand. "Does it mean anything to you?" Mrs. Holt gasped and hurried off into another room as Cassie made her way around to the front of the wheelchair. "You saved me, didn't you?" she said, throwing her arms around Lillian Morgan. "I don't know how, but you did it." Mrs. Holt brought the coat and said it belonged to her sister's daughter, Margaret. It had a button missing, a button exactly like the button Cassie had had in her hand. Margaret was about your age when she got caught in a blizzard and froze to death. But that was a long, long time ago. There may have been some doubts in the mind of Mrs. Holt, but there was none in Cassie's mind. She leaned forward and kissed Lillian Morgan on the cheek. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you very much." As the Anders family turned to go, Mrs. Holt couldn't help noticing a single tear drifting down the cheek of her sister. On the way home, Cassie turned to her father and said, "I don't know why, Daddy, but all that's happened has made me think more of Mama. Not in a sad way, but in a way that helps me understand more about people. I mean, we're all connected, aren't we, Daddy?" "Yes," he said, "we are." I believe that stories about miracles help us to open our minds, to open our consciousness, to open our soul to the mystery of what life is. And when you get an opening in your own soul, pay attention, because it is there for you.